The film begins with a narration from the lead actress, Grace, as she tells her children about how God creates the earth in 7 days. The opening credits feature eerie drawings of our characters and showcase various moments from the film. The haunting music and creepy imagery create an effective introduction to the movie. The film is set in 1945, shortly after World War II. Grace wakes up screaming from a nightmare. We are introduced to 3 characters: housekeeper Bertha Mills, gardener Edmund Tuttle, and their mute assistant Lydia. Bertha hints that Lydia is older than she appears, foreshadowing events revealed later in the film. Grace has recently hired them after the previous servants mysteriously disappeared a week ago. Her husband, Charles, went off to war a year and a half ago and hasn't returned. Grace explains that no door in the house can be opened without the previous one being closed, as the house has no electricity due to wartime disruption. Bertha tries to dissuade Grace from giving them a tour of the entire house, but Grace insists. She emphasizes the need to close all the curtains and lights up a lantern. We also meet her 2 children, Anne and Nicholas, who suffer from an unknown light-sensitive disease. During breakfast, the children mention their mother's past breakdown. Anne cryptically tells Bertha that Mommy goes mad, but before she can clarify, Grace enters the room. Grace's emergence from the darkness into the light gives her an eerie demeanor. Grace questions Bertha about Lydia's muteness, but Bertha remains silent. They hear the sound of a crying child, which Anne attributes to Victor, a boy living in the house. Grace doesn't believe her, blaming the servants for an unlocked door instead. Grace scolds the servants, fearing that an open door might expose her children to light. Nicholas expresses a fear of ghosts, but Grace reassures him with her religious beliefs. Anne's mysterious comment about her mother going mad adds tension. 3 days later, Anne is still being punished, and Grace asks Bertha to tell Lydia to stop running around upstairs. However, Grace hears footsteps above her and becomes frustrated. She asks Anne about the noise, but doesn't get a clear answer. Grace apologizes to Anne and Nicholas and emphasizes the importance of telling the truth, warning them of eternal punishment for dishonesty. Nicholas confesses his apprehension about ghosts, but Grace ignores it because of her religious beliefs. Bertha notifies Grace about Lydia's unusual conduct and notes Victor's presence at the house. Grace is still suspicious, believing they are simply fiction. Grace finds an unlocked door that Anne claims Victor used, but she blames the maids. Grace scolds the staff in a critical time, afraid for the safety of her children. When Nicholas asks about Victor, Anne says that spirits wear white sheets. That night, Anne pretends to have a conversation with Victor, startling her brother. Grace rushes to the room upon hearing Nicholas scream, but Anne denies any wrongdoing. Grace punishes Anne by making her read from the Bible, creating a tense atmosphere. 3 days later, Anne is still being punished, and Grace insists on her asking for forgiveness. Bertha mentions that Lydia has been causing disturbances upstairs. Grace hears running footsteps above her and becomes frustrated. Grace asks Anne about the noise, but Anne, having recently been disciplined, hesitates to talk about it. Grace decides to investigate, heading to a room filled with furniture covered in white sheets. Grace begins to hear breathing and whispers, which intensify as she uncovers the sheets. She sees the door behind her closing on its own and rushes outside. She hears noises all around the house, as if several people were inside, claiming the house is theirs. Grace dismisses the idea of ghosts, suspecting intruders. Bertha shows her a drawing of the supposed other family living there. Armed with a shotgun, Grace searches the house with the servants. A face appears behind her, startling her. Despite not finding intruders, Grace discovers a disturbing book filled with pictures of dead people. Bertha reveals that it's a book of the dead, their souls preserved through portraits. She mentions her past work in the house and an outbreak of tuberculosis. Grace apologizes to a seemingly asleep Anne for her harshness. Nicholas asks about his dad, and Grace assures him Charles will return when the war ends. Grace breaks down clinging to her husband's coat, who, in her nightmare, appears to leave for war. Grace awakens alone and rushes downstairs upon hearing the piano playing by itself. She locks the piano but finds it open again. She starts to believe that something supernatural is in the house. Bertha admits her belief in the supernatural, suggesting the world of the dead can mix with the living. Grace decides to bring a priest to bless the house and instructs Mr. Tuttle to search for gravestones with certain names on the property. However, Mr. Tuttle hides the gravestones instead. Grace wanders into the woods, reuniting with her husband Charles, who has returned from the war. Charles seems emotionally distant and mentions searching for his home. Grace introduces Charles to Bertha, who is shocked by his return. Charles appears confused and reunites with his joyful, disbelieving children. During dinner, Grace asks where people go after dying in war. Charles seems distant, and Grace questions how to differentiate good from bad sides in war. Anne mentions the intruders, which infuriates Grace. Anne starts breathing heavily, just as Grace did earlier. Grace angrily tells her to stop breathing and leaves the room, crying, comforted by Bertha. Bertha mentions her past working in the house to Mr. Tuttle, saying Grace will eventually see the intruders. She cryptically adds that things will change once Grace encounters them. Later, Bertha and Tuttle discuss the family, with Bertha believing Anne will be easier to convince. Grace dresses Anne in a white communion dress and veil, ironically resembling the ghostly figures Anne described earlier. Anne plays with puppets on the floor despite her mother's warnings. When Grace re-enters the room, Anne has transformed into a creepy old lady. Grace starts choking the old lady, revealed to be Anne. Bertha rushes in, and Anne accuses her mother of trying to kill her. Bertha explains that she left Anne in her father's care. Grace questions Anne about the incident, and Charles hints at a separate event. Nicholas claims not to remember, but Charles implies that Grace goes mad that day, referencing the same incident. Charles reveals he returned to say goodbye and must leave again. Grace angrily wishes he had never gone to war, and Charles embraces and makes love to her one last time before departing for good. Grace wakes up to an empty spot beside her, realizing Charles is gone. The children waking up to find all the curtains missing from the house. Grace runs away from the light and looks for the drapes. Bertha says the children's condition has been resolved. Grace loses her temper and holds a pistol to Bertha's head, demanding the keys and orders her to go. Bertha and Lydia leave the house quietly, knowing Grace will not be able to flee. Grace searches the house for the missing curtains in vain, but she can't find them. She suspects her mother is mad and sets off with her children to discover their father. Nicholas follows, and the two arrive to 3 gravestones. Grace explores Bertha and Lydia's beds and uncovers a distressing discovery: a photograph of the 3 deceased slaves from 1891 and their gravestones, which are gradually getting closer and closer. Grace attempts and fails with a shotgun to repel them. Bertha confesses that they all died of disease and locks Grace out, relying on her incapacity to access the house without her prior act. Bertha believes that the living and the dead must learn to live together. The children, who are hiding in the home, hear a woman's voice pleading with them to accompany her. An elderly woman unexpectedly unlocks their closet door. Grace goes upstairs to confront the invaders, and the startling plot twist of the film is revealed. Grace enters a room with numerous other individuals, including the blind old woman Anne mentioned. The elderly woman talks with the children and writes their replies, indicating that Grace and the children are the spirits haunting the house. The father explains that they will depart in the morning, and the mother gets afraid, refusing to stay in a haunted house. She tells that Grace becomes insane and smothers her children before killing herself, probably while waiting for her husband to return from the war. Anne possessed the elderly lady at one time, explaining Grace's image of her in the white robe and veil. The father informs Nicholas that they will depart after the conflict is done. Grace sobs, stating she wishes Charles hadn't gone to war. Grace embraces her children in the last scenes of the movie while recognizing the house as theirs. As the movie ends, Victor glances at the house as the family leaves, locking the gate and showing a for sale sign. The Others, released in 2001. Directed by Alejandro Amenabar, produced on a budget of approximately $17 million. Unlike many horror films, The Others relies heavily on atmosphere and psychological tension rather than jump scares or graphic imagery. The film is particularly well known for its twist ending, which left many viewers stunned and re-evaluating the entire movie. The Others is a masterclass in atmospheric horror and remains a favorite among fans of the genre for its unique approach to storytelling and its emphasis on mood and tension. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Turn on the notifications and leave a like to help the channel out.